And what is really important here is that it is not only the global responsiveness of global migration governance alone that really can really change the structural conditions that are creating these vulnerabilities. So the policy,
Excuse
the
me,
governance is
if
just like
Professor
institution.
Hennebree can listen.
Other
We
legal
have reached
policies,
the time.
citizenship policies, visa policies, immigration policies, and all kinds of policies, they really have close, they work I mean, they work side by side. Having only policies, migration policies alone is not sufficient. So therefore, all these policies in the other sectors, economic sectors, social sectors, cultural sectors, and all kinds of policies, they also should really rethink and reimagine and place women at the center. So only then that would help to really address, get to the roots of the problems that women migrants are facing. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't hear anything. I hope I'm audible and you are hearing me. Thank you very much.
So let me thank Hari as well as Professor Hennebree for bringing in the aspect of precarity onto the discussion. And precarity, as we would be aware, is a much debated upon concept. And now we have our last speaker coming in, and she will be Swasti Sharma from Satyavati College, University of Delhi. And her topic today would be Invisible Woman, Discerning the Plight of Migrant Women During COVID-19. Before I ask her to proceed, let me remind you that there is an interaction towards the end, and we will right away go into that. So now we have Swasti Sharma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes,
yeah.
You are.
Good evening, everyone. At the very outset, let me begin by thanking the organizing committee of this conference for giving me an opportunity to present my paper. As you can see, I'll just share the screen in a bit. My paper is entitled Invisible Woman, Discerning the Plight of Migrant Women During COVID-19. So I'll just start sharing the screen. I think it should be visible now.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me begin with an observation from International Organization for Migration fact sheet number 6 on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants. It states, and I quote, some of the 272 million international migrants worldwide are more vulnerable than others because of personal, social, situational, and structural factors. Their vulnerabilities may be exacerbated in the crisis situation, as it is the case with COVID-19 pandemic, unquote. Internal migration or domestic migration refers to displacement, movement, and rehabilitation of people within a defined geopolitical space or a nation state. Several factors have contributed to internal migration, including jobs, education, opportunities, civil disturbance, etc. However, the year 2020 has witnessed an exponential mobility, especially in developing countries like India, owing to COVID-19 pandemic. In an attempt to flatten the curve, India initiated firm travel restrictions and lockdown. This culminated in an employment dip. Sohini Sen Gupta and Manish Shah have noted in their joint study titled Social Policy, COVID-19 and Impoverished Migrants, Challenges and Prospects in the Lockdown India that, I quote, the suffering borne by the uprooted informal workers who constitute more than 90% of India's workforce and have helped to build India's US $2.9 trillion economy, demonstrate the frailty of state social protection system, the erosion of recent progress, and the urgent need for state welfare measures to be more robust and accountable, unquote. It is imperative to note that economic liberalization has expanded the demand for workforce. Conversely, the workforce, which constitutes a substantial number of migrant women, are left vulnerable due to the scarcity of basic rights emanating from unregulated labor laws. The voice of these dispossessed women who hail from Dalit, Adivasi, low-income backgrounds are drowned in the cacophony of masculinist discourse, eulogizing endurance and resilience. The research paper will primarily attempt to encompass anecdotes of these marginalized women who are caught in the spiral of silence. Media had captured their predicament fleetingly before the Unlock 1.0 was introduced. Estimates suggest that women are more likely to become the victims of trafficking, sexual harassment, and violence under the state of economic depression. Amidst the global catastrophe, stigmatization, and exclusion, uh, the migrant women's condition has become more and more pitiable. Migrant women have been systematically invisibilized from policy recommendations. The subjugation fundamentally ensues from a lack of social security and counseling. The Interstate Migrant Workmen Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act 1979, enacted by the Parliament of India to regulate the condition of service of interstate laborers in the Indian labor law, couldn't curb the recent migrant exodus, and therefore it should be revisited. Impediments posed by the socioeconomic status, cultural linguistic barriers, and the urgency to address the widening gender gap are some of the ancillary concerns that contour the discourse. Electronic media and print media have captured the images of millions of migrant workers in India who began their tedious journey home, women carrying children, clutching their meager possessions, and crowded, disrupted transport networks during the lockdown in the wake of the novel coronavirus pandemic. As the factories in the cities were brought to a halt, they faced hunger, destitution, and the fear of tragic death. The pandemic resulting from coronavirus is the gravest health emergency of our times. It is poised to disrupt social, economic, and political systems and lives worldwide. According to Johns Hopkins University and Medicine Research 2020, COVID-19 confirmed cases in India stood at 95,698 with 3,025 deaths, nearly 3.2% case fatality till 18th May 2020. The International Labour Organization estimates a loss of 25 million jobs, and UNDP foresees USD 220 billion in loss of income for developing countries. In such a scenario, the attention must be given to the status of migrant women as they are doubly marginalized owing to their gender and class. Migrant home-based women workers who form the lowest rungs of India's labor chain are working for as little as rupees 10 or 15 for over 8 hours a day during the pandemic in the face of employers' apathy and the lack of access to urban welfare schemes, a study by labor rights organization Ajivika Bureau has found. While public attention has remained focused on the workers' exodus during the lockdown, the distress of migrant families that chose to remain in India's cities remains undocumented. In some textile hubs of India, women from many such families are employed as home-based workers by domestic and global businesses. Many of them told the researchers that they were struggling to survive because their wages had gone unpaid and debts were mounting. Home-based workers who usually perform subcontracted work on a piece rate basis are dealing with twin vulnerabilities. As I have mentioned before, they are both migrants and also women. HomeNet South Asia, a network of home-based workers across 8 countries, defines these workers as, quote, informal sector workers who carry out remunerative work from their own homes or adjacent grounds or premises, unquote. A study conducted by Laura Foley and Nicole Piper has reiterated that, and I quote, a migrant worker's choice of jobs is constrained by the gender division of labor that characterizes the world of work, whereby men and women often enter different sectors or perform different duties if working within the same sector. Women, especially migrant women, are often employed in the jobs at the bottom ranks, which typically involve tasks that are culturally devalued and receive limited socio-legal recognition. In migration corridors, where bilateral agreements constitute the key regulatory mode, women are directly channeled into a limited range of sectors, particularly domestic work or nursing. There exists a persistent gender wage gap, and migrant women disproportionately work in more precarious, insecure, and informal employment that receives low pay. Women are more likely to experience violence within workplaces, and migrant women, especially those working informally, will face difficulties accessing reproductive health care while they have little or no social protection. Migrant women are therefore less protected from job losses and economic recession. Also, while migrant women are among the lowest earners, they remit a greater percentage of their income than men, leaving the issue of their mental health during the migration an open but necessary question. Many of these inequalities have been laid bare and are likely to be made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, unquote. Then there is another subaltern subset, that
Professor
of the
Sharma,
yes, sir.
we have 1 more minute in the schedule. Yeah.
Sir, I'll try to wind up. Then there is another subaltern subset, that is of the differently abled migrant women, and they form one of the most vulnerable section of the society. To understand the struggle of the differently abled migrant women in India, we should closely look at the political economy and their social deprivation. Leaflet.in cited reports suggesting that the rate of suicide among female migrant workers is on the rise, and the irregularity of their immigration status is directly proportionate to the amount of abuse they suffer. Now, the COVID-19, as I have demonstrated, does not discriminate who it affects, and the health, legal, and psychological response to the virus should neither. Following are some of the recommendations of different organizations that have contributed to ensure that no one is left behind in the response to COVID-19, including migrant women. Ensuring access to safe facilities, UNDP indicates that safe facilities, especially at the borders, can help reduce the risk of contagion and situation of sexual and gender-based violence. And this must be provided to the migrant population, even those with irregular statuses. And some other potential solutions to the problem include providing bonuses and extraordinary payments, providing protection equipment against COVID-19 in migrant assistance centers, and ensuring access to healthcare services without discrimination. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Sharma. And once again, the gender aspect is coming to the fore, and this time more focus on informalities and the frailties of the systemic welfare, and about aspects like choices and the genderings there. In fact, invisibility in itself is a very contentious issue. So thank you, Professor Sharma, for sharing your views. And now thank you. And the papers I mean, the speakers might have more to say, but we have that regular time limits. Now, shall I invite, without much delay, Ashika to handle the interactives, if there are, and afterwards we will conclude this presentation session and move to the next. So Ashika.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I hope you all learned and enjoyed throughout the session. Now we move on to the interaction session. We have one question ready, and it's for Mr. Mohammed Fatan. Fatan, I hope you're ready. So the question goes like this.
I'm ready.
There are Indian migrants in Malaysia working as agricultural workers. Their working conditions are poor. What are the policies that can protect their rights? You may answer.
After Malaysia authority arrest Bangladesh migrant worker that feature in Al Jazeera documentary, so the Malaysia had changed the government that mindset, got the government, I think, the policy, and also the back channel between negotiation by Indian High Commission in Kuala Lumpur with Malaysia. if the Indian migrant they overstay in Malaysia, they can get back by special flight to India because of the first or the large migrant worker in Malaysia about agricultural is Indonesian, not Indian, and second is Nepal, and third is Philippines, and India I think the fourth and fifth, and the most of migrant worker from Indian migrant worker in Malaysia, they are working in service sector, not in agricultural sector. You got my answer?
Yes, Fatan, thank you for answering the question.
Yes, yes.
So
Thank you.
this concludes the session. So this has been a very interesting and insightful session for all of us. I'm confident that your experience is the same. So on the behalf of the organizing committee, I extend my gratitude to all the participants of the session. Thank you for sharing your findings and study with us. And a big thank you to Matthew sir for being there throughout the session. Then I would also like to thank the crew behind the curtain for having worked tirelessly to make the session as organized and efficient as possible. So thank you everyone. So we'll be starting the next session in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashika, and thank you for coordinating the session. And before we go to the next session with Paddy, Paddy is already present here. And let me also thank all the presenters who went from through regional context into certain contentious issues, gendering, invisibilities, and also those things that might be taking very ironic turns like invisibility, with which we entered, because invisibility in terms of surveillance is not there, but at the same time, invisibility in terms of welfare is very much there. So these kinds of contradictions also operate on the grounds of migration, and that's a session which has possibilities to stretch from. And now I think we'll have a 1 minute pause, not a break, and then we will start the next session. Thank you all the audience, and please be there. We are back.
Hello everyone. Welcome back to the final session of the day. We have Ms. Paddy Sianga Knudsen, Migration Governance Analyst and Consultant with International Organization for Migration, the Gambia. So I invite Mr. Matthew Varghese, Assistant Professor of School of International Relations and Politics, NG University, to chair the session.
Thank you once again, Ashika. And now we are back, and we are back for the special lecture of the session. And we've been waiting to listen to Paddy Sianga Knudsen. And let me add that I'm taking a kind of a confidence in pronouncing the third name Knudsen, because I think I have been familiar with some Scandinavian people who pronounce like that. Maybe I'm wrong, so she can correct me. I hope Patty is listening. And so on behalf of all the organizers who have come together on the platform, let me invite Patty Sianga, and a Zambian national with a fantastic academic career with SOAS and the London School of Economics as institutional pecs, and also the kind of realms that he has been working in, especially in terms of developmental economics, and the kind of experience that she's been having through non-governmental sectors, interactions with state systems spanning from China, Malaysia, Zambia, Tanzania, East and Southern Africa. That's like a huge span of experience with interests ranging from migration governance, labor migration, returnees, and also the interactives, especially the relationship to China in the region, which is again a very nuanced realm in itself. So so there might be lots more to add, and I'm just pausing there. And with much happiness, and on behalf of all the organizers, let me invite Patty Sianga Knudsen for the digital space for our special lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wonder if you can
I
hear
think,
me.
Patty, you have logged in 2 places. So one you remove, otherwise there will be echo.
How is that now?
Yes.
No, you have in 2 places actually.
Okay,
So,
can you hear me now?
it is okay. I think it is working well. So we go ahead.
Let me.
You're very audible. It's okay. I think she was there fine.
Please unmute. Please unmute. Patty, please unmute.
I think she was visible. When she logged off, we lost her.
Hello, how is it now?
Now, yeah, you were very visible, and you were visible before as well. Yeah, please continue.
Was I visible before?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I just tried to see if I can take off.
No,
Can you hear me?
actually now the echo is coming. So what you can do, you log out from both and log in again. That
So
is
I log
better.
out from both and log in again.
Yes.
All right, I do that very quickly.
Yes.
Okay. So I leave here. Okay. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're audible, Paddy.
You
Paddy,
can see.
you were audible as well as visible before, and it
was I?
Yeah. So it was fine.
Let me try to see, because now I do not see our screen, all the participants, and I'm trying to see. There we are, but I think you do not see me. And if I say start video, what does it do? It shows me upside down. Is that right?
Yes.
No, just to do one more
How
rotation,
do you
it will be okay. One more rotation.
Where do you change the rotation?
There is option in the start video.
Oh, wonderful.
You go
I'm
to
so
the
sorry
choose
about
background.
this.
There is rotation option.
Okay, let's do this very quickly.
There is a rotation option. If you go there.
If I say save.
In the screen itself on the top
so on
right.
the screen of all of us, on the top right, you have speaker view.
Yes.
You have speaker view, and then you have exit. And somehow
excuse me, can I say something? You
know yes.
what?
Just make it normal.
The system that you were having in the beginning was working fine. You can just go back to the beginning. I mean, whatever you were doing before, it was fine.
Yes.
All right. Let me go back. Then I think I have to log on to you from my phone, and I will do that right away so that you can see me. And then okay, now it's asking me for a meeting passcode, which it didn't ask me before. So let me see if I can ask.
There is a link I can give you immediately.
Yes, Dr. Divi, I think, has sent it to me, and now I'm entering. Okay, that should be fine. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for this upside down, but I see some of us are also upside down in this room. And just as we're trying to see, you know, how we settle down, maybe just a little bit of a teaser as the technical part is working. So you cannot, you won't be able to see me, but at least you're able to hear me for the second. And, you know, when I think about migration, and I think I have been listening for the last couple of days to the different presentations that have been made. And in fact, I think, could you just allow me to share presentation, please? Sada, if you can allow me to share a presentation, because I have a short presentation. Sada, if you can go ahead and share with me, allow me to share screen. Okay, thank you, Sada. So as I was thinking about, you know, what could be a potential theme for us to deliberate, because I think this has really been much a space of engaging and not sort of a space where we come and give out what our thoughts, our reflections are in terms of research papers we have done, or from an area of expertise that we have been working on in terms of migration. But I think it's been more to provide a lot of input about what's happening around the migration space. And I think a lot has been heard. Actually, I had prepared a very long presentation at some point with a lot of statistics, a lot of trends to show different numbers and things like that. But I think after 2 days, and I've listened to most of the conference, that on internal migration yesterday, and even today, even as we have entered into the international space of migration and what that means for different countries, through the different presentations, I thought that it would be a bit of an overkill, actually, and an overload, if you like, of information. So what I just thought that we could do, can you see my screen? Can somebody say if they can see my screen?
Yes.
Does the screen show? Okay. Dr. Sada, do you just mind to send me the meeting code in the meantime?
Okay,
if at all reflecting on your side, then I can have everything everybody can see me in full view. I think that would be nice.
Okay.
So I would talk from one screen, but mute the other one. So then in thinking about that, in thinking about what has migration really meant, and the question there that I was posing to myself, even as we were speaking with Professor Divya, was that, you know, when she said to me, oh, so Paddy, you know, seeing this vast background that you have, first of all, what's your expertise? And I said, that's very interesting, that I've never really felt to have a very particular niche into migration. I entered the world of migration as an economist, and particularly because I was interested in understanding how people facilitate their livelihoods by moving to another country. I myself come from a country, from a family of migrants, and a lot of people, it's not a very surprising thing, because a lot of people in the country that I come from, which is Zambia, have either themselves embarked on a journey in a regular way, or on an irregular way, for that matter. But I'm also coming from a country where, when we talk about migration, people don't tend to think that it really concerns them, because we are not like the Gambia, where you have a bigger majority of the population that has either attempted or has more family members that have attempted a trip or two, whether it's a regular or in an irregular way. And maybe we may not be like Nigeria, that receives a lot of migrants, not just from, not just from their, from their neighboring countries, but further away. The same will go with South Africa and Kenya or Rwanda. And maybe we're not like other countries that have been inflicted by conflict, whether we're talking about conflict that has happened in the past, regardless of the motivation around or the causes around the conflict. So we are a country we regard ourselves relatively peaceful, relatively stable, but we're also quite a mobile population. So it's very interesting that when you talk about the narrative on migration and what it sort of means, a lot of people would sort of see, when you say in Zambia, well, I'm moving to a country, they expect you to move to the United Kingdom, because we have a lot of linkages with the United Kingdom as a country that colonized Zambia some years ago. And then at the same time, a lot of people would also expect you to move maybe to greener pastures, to Dubai because you work in the service sector, or you would move to India because you're moving to study, or to China because you're moving there to study, or it's a short-term trip, so mobility movement into Turkey, into Thailand, and all these places. But we've never really, I think a lot of people on the street don't get this sense as being an aspect of mobility and migration. But one of the interesting things, and that's why I'm still hanging around on my on the title of the presentation here, is that for you to make these journeys, for you to be able to take these movements, to approach any kind of a border, is that you need some kind of national identity card. First, a national identity card, because this is how you get a national passport in the country that I come from. But that happens a lot in many other countries, including those that are represented here in this room, that the passport allows us to make the different journeys. But that usually starts from having some kind of a national ID, which in a lot of countries, especially countries that have been prone to conflict or that are in a post-conflict mode, make it a difficult requirement for people that need to make the necessary movements, no matter the motivation for the migration or for them to leave the country of origin. So in thinking about that, but then I went a bit further and thought, it's not just the passport. Sometimes you must have the right passport. What allows you to cross one border to another? You would need a stamp, a visa. Lucky if you have a visa waiver between countries like Tanzania and Zambia and most of SADC countries, where you could move relatively freely, or you would need a visa waiver. In some countries, you get a visa waiver. For instance, a Zambian arriving in Malaysia can enter for 3 months without having to require a visa. And in some cases, you need a visa that's probably available in the country, in your home country. And that means that you have an embassy or a visa application center that allows you to process this visa. But in some cases, because of reduction of government services, so for instance, the Canadians, the United Kingdom have centralized their visa application processes and made these sort of regional hubs. So for instance, if you were traveling to Canada, like one of my friend's mother was traveling to Canada to visit her, she had to go to Tanzania and have her papers processed there. So there's, you know, just having a national identity doesn't cut it. You having a passport doesn't cut it. You going through a visa process doesn't cut it. And this is when we talk about people who are traveling in a much more regular way. What more the challenges that people who have to travel in a much irregular way, where they use facilitators, and in some cases they're also using smugglers, and in other cases human traffickers get engaged in trying to help people cross these borders that have been made by governments in terms of controlling, in terms of security, but have become in one way or another a hindrance to allowing people to have that pathway to migration. So in talking about this, I thought I could also just correct a bit that, you know, I do a lot of different consultancy work. IOM in the Gambia has been one of them, but also as part of my work, I develop programs and projects around migration in different areas with other partners, including IOM, as well as working with consultancy firms that will provide different kind of services, whether it's research migration or whether it's monitoring and evaluation. So on that note, I just thought, what could I, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear,
Is my screen showing? Or has my screen changed? No, my screen is showing.
Yeah. Your screen is visible, Patty.
All right, okay, that's good. So on that note, maybe I start by, before I get into the presentation, to just thank all the different organizers for this.
No, there is echo again, but I think only one login is better.
Where do you get the echo?
Maybe because of two places, no, some
I
sound
think
is.
so. Okay, yeah, let's make this. Yeah, let me know if I go off screen. Is that better?
Yes, ma'am, it's completely fine. Please do continue.
Now it is okay.
Is that okay? Sorry, then I may not be too. I'll just switch off the. How is it now? That's much.
Now it is okay.
Now it is okay. Sorry, technical glitches. So just to thank again all the organizers for this conference. We're second day in with a lot of inputs. Like I have mentioned, long days. So I tried to keep this presentation brief, and that is also less scientific because we've heard a lot of numbers, trends, as well as issues and prospects that have been outlined in the papers that have been presented on international and internal migration. So I just thought maybe we have a zoom into the intra-regional migration situation on the African continent. Sada, I see a hand.
No issue. You carry on.
Carry on. Okay, thank you.
Only thing is, I think there are two login. That's why there is no proper.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Hello.
Excuse
yes,
me,
we can hear you.
Paddy, you're audible. I think you don't have to. You can just carry on. It's all fine.
Just carry on. Just carry on.
We carry on. Okay. So, just talking a little bit about the tracks and the motivations there. I think it's very important for us to understand that a lot of the intra-regional migration, and so that is the migration that's happening within the African continent, is largely driven by regional governance policies. So some of you may know that the African continent is sort of divided into what we call regional building blocks. And these regional building blocks build up to what should be the African economic community. And so there are quite a number of regional blocks, which would have members from different countries and sometimes overlapping membership between countries. So for instance, Zambia would come from, would be a member of COMESA and would also be a member of SADC. And a lot of these regional governance policies would encourage, for instance, free movement of people. And I'm talking about ECOWAS, SADC, the East African Community, COMESA, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Of course, each of them in various degrees of where they are in terms of the provisions that are provided for citizens to have this free movement. But this has been largely affected by this. Another thing I thought, which would be interesting for us to think about, is sort of looking at what kind of routes are there. And they have borrowed from the African Development Bank, which sort of tries to depict a picture of what are the kind of movements that are taking place. I mean, you have a West African movement, you have a North African movement, a Southern African movement, as well as movement that's heading to the Horn of Africa. And I think this has much to say about movement in terms of migration flows, that a majority of migration is actually taking place within the continent. And as a matter of fact, IOM has just released a report that tries to break down, or rather clarify, or rather also cement some of these, let's call them information that has been out there about what type of movement is happening on the African continent in terms of migration. Country destinations really depend on the motivation to move. When you think about South Africa, countries like Nigeria, Botswana, Kenya, in these countries, a lot of people are moving because of work opportunities and long-term settlement. Tanzania, Namibia, the Gambia, Uganda have very thriving tourism sectors, even though tourism is not very unique to particular African countries. But I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries would understand this phenomenon, but there's a lot of uniqueness about it. And therefore, migrant workers are traveling to work in the tourism industry. Some are moving to work as teachers. So for instance, Namibia, Botswana takes a lot of teachers from Zambia. Some would say it's a brain drain, Others would say it's a circulation. There's also a lot of movement for domestic work. So for instance, Malawian women, young men moving to work for domestic work in Tanzania. And there's also a lot of movement that is being seen in the recent years with the construction industry. Ghana, Mauritius, Uganda, South Africa, Rwanda are just among some of the examples of where migrants would go for education opportunities. And then there's also a lot of movement within these regional blocks. Are they moving for trade? Are people moving in terms of transit? When you think about countries where there's huge populations that have come to seek refuge because they're escaping conflict, there's political instability, or as a result of climate change and environmental related movements. So this would be countries like Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, and this is just looking at countries in South and Eastern part. Cross-border movements are another thing that that allow people to move because borders are very artificial, and sometimes you have two tribes split between borders, and sometimes you just have had communities that have existed pre-colonial times that continue to rely on each other for various reasons, whether it's trade, culture, or other exchanges. So just to highlight a little bit, for instance, migration within West Africa is accounting for around 90% of the total migration within West Africa. And this is around 7 times more than the people that are heading to Europe. So this is just to give a picture of what it looks like. So we're talking about people moving from Sierra Leone to the Gambia, from the Gambia to Senegal, from Senegal to Ivory Coast, from Ivory Coast to Ghana, from Ghana to Nigeria, and many other options remain possible. Coming down south, migrants move from Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Tanzania, Mozambique, heading down to South Africa for various motivations. And the same is happening from Kenya, from West Africa, and from other parts, heading to the Horn of Africa for transit migration into Europe and to other parts. So this is just to give a picture of, the tracks and the motivations. So let's take a look at what happened, particularly during COVID. Oops, sorry about that. Can you hear me? Today is the day for technical glitches.
No, you
yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Very good. I just wanted to make sure that I'm audible. Oops. Hello, I can't hear you. Sada, you?
Yes, tell me.
Okay, there we go.
Yes.
So what happened during COVID? We have a caseload right now of around 1.6 million and close to 40,000 deaths. But the global numbers are heading to 39 million with around close to 2 million deaths. Hopefully we don't get to 2 million deaths. And the most affected countries in Africa are Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and lately Ethiopia, Morocco, and Algeria have joined those. But it's safe to say no African country has been left unaffected. At the same time, if you compare these numbers with how the numbers were in June, you can see that there has been an increase of caseload. I think in June, we were looking at 382,000 at least, with around 9,600 deaths. So the numbers have gone up. And the responses have been different. There are countries like Rwanda that really went very quick and reacted very, very promptly to the news of COVID breaking out in China, and took measures immediately in terms of all the different measures that are recommended by WHO, and really in a localized context, putting disposable, mobile, let's call it mobile hand washing by bus stops, understanding what it means in terms of lockdowns and social distancing. So these were the kind of responses. And in other countries, parts of West Africa, Madagascar, the hunt for a remedy or something that helps with reducing the effects of COVID was created. And here I'm talking about preventive measures in terms of herbal medicine. In fact, I just read a few weeks ago that the WHO has given a go-ahead for Madagascar to go ahead and test out its herbal remedy. So this for the African continent is really something that puts it on the map. Of course, deaths have been unavoided, and the same goes with the impact of COVID on vulnerable groups that include migrants. And the responses from different governments have come in light of trying to encourage social distancing in this very densely populated continent. 1.3 billion people, a lot of them relying on the informal sector, a lot of young people, but also these present some new opportunities and some new ways in which we can reset, in which we can restructure how we manage and how we support people to make their livelihoods, whether they are migrants or citizens. So some of the responses that governments took to were not unique to Africa: lockdowns, border closures, no social activity, no economic activities. And in some pockets, you had some returns in the very early beginnings, just before the lockdowns took over. And returns have now resumed since some of the countries lightened the lockdowns and the border closures, so the so-called reopenings. But the very direct impact on migrants has been that they've been restricted movements and less jobs. And this is particularly for those who are in an irregular situation. So you have moved to another country in an irregular way. It becomes very difficult for you to find a job when that big informal sector is shut down, when private sector is very much impacted, but probably not having enough stimulus package directed its way. So businesses have shrank. And the middle class is also tightening its expenditure, of which a lot of the migrant workers, like I explained, domestic workers, construction workers, are relying on services that are demanded by these citizens in these destination countries. It's also meant that migrants are unable to access healthcare, as well as social protection services, and as well as protecting themselves. The border closures have also meant that, irregular migration has limited return of migrants. So when migrants have been ready to go back home, they have not been able to. Some migrants have had to take a bit of dangerous routes, because remember that in the context of intra-regional migration, there is a new bubble out there of international migration outside of the continent. So some of the migrants were caught in the middle of where they would be. And I just thought to share, this is old news, but it's sitting in the context, as you can see on the left side, of how migration looked like in terms of irregular migration, since I already depicted the picture for you of how it looks like for regular migration in my opening. So it meant that a lot of these migrants, so let's say in West Africa, got stuck in Niger to go back home, or to continue with the journey, or to find a plan B. So these are the kind of scenarios that a lot of these migrants were left in. And that also meant that because the borders were locked down, they had to find alternative routes. In East Africa, there's a concept called Mpanya routes. And Mpanya routes is basically, Mpanya is a rat. So we know that rats can be very clever to squeeze themselves out of any sticky situation. And these are the kind of dangerous routes that some of the migrants have had to take because of these border closures. And remember, there are a lot being in an irregular situation. So it's not a matter of just going to the border, asking to get that access, or going to your embassy, asking to get that access to that AVRR if it exists. So at the same time, I explained that a lot of migrants are working in the informal sector. And that means that wages were cut down. When wages are cut down, we also know that remittances are cut down. So, and the impact goes just beyond the migrants to their families back home who are expecting these remittances that support their very livelihood. And here we're talking about basic education, health, care of the elderly that they've left behind, care of their families, and in some cases where parents have left and they have left their children behind with their families. Other sort of social, if we could think about it, a lot of mental health issues, of course, arising from, loss of wages, loss of a feeling of hopelessness and not really knowing when this pandemic ends, sometimes hunger, because a lot of social protection programs and schemes did not cater for migrants in a lot of the different countries. So which meant that migrants had to look out for themselves. It was okay for migrants who were living within communities, and this is the case in most places, where there was some kind of social cohesion between migrants and citizens, and you could see a common pot of people sharing. But in some cases, it was not always as bright. And I just picked this article that talks about the xenophobic violence against non-nationals in South Africa. It's important to point out that South Africa stands out, but it's not the only one. A lot of news doesn't make it to the news. But because of the epicenter, that South Africa first being an epicenter of COVID, and another thing is that it's also the hub and the key destination for a lot of African migrants on the southern route, the highlight stands on South Africa in terms of some of the difficulties that migrants face during this time. The picture on the left there is showing just very recently what has happened in Niger, where you had around 100 or less migrants from Sierra Leone who have finally been able to go home with the assistance of IOM after being stranded for 6 months. They were not sitting in hotels or sitting at a friend's place or sitting comfortably in a transit center, but crammed a lot with only the resources that civil society organizations and international organizations could provide. And you can imagine how difficult a situation it could have been in those 6 months. But, suffice to say that countries like countries that are within the European Union and others, predominantly the European Union, has assisted with these returns of people coming home. And here we're just talking about intra-regional migration. So from Niger in this case, back to Sierra Leone. Then let's talk about the prospects, because the picture can look very gloomy. What does it look like in terms of the prospects and the developments that are happening around the African continent? The big thing these days, our big buzzword, is this African Free Continental Trade Agreement. And it sounds like one European Union for us, where everyone will be able to trade with everyone. A number of countries have laid down the different instruments so that it's, the protocol is ratified in that sense. And it should have commenced 1st of July, where this open trade, one big market that brings together 1.3 billion people in trade could have happened 1st of July, but it didn't. But still, there's a lot of groundwork to be covered. And it's been postponed to open in the 1st of January. So we're looking forward to the new year and what this will mean. But what does this mean then for intra-regional migration? We're hoping that with trade comes people moving, whether they're moving goods or they're moving to facilitate manufacturing in one place or another, or to facilitate, to follow different ambitions that could be in line with the opportunities that are offered. So we're expecting that the numbers would gradually grow. But of course, we would need to make sure that all these processes allow migrants to have those legal pathways. Because in as much as you have a lot of protocols that allow free movement, or you have a lot of pathways that allow migrants to move from one African country to another, we're still one of the continents where a Zambia national like myself until a few months ago, had to get a visa to go to the Gambia. And these kind of visa facilitation arrangements would definitely need to be lifted to facilitate this kind of movement. And I think there are a lot of groundwork that's taking place in the context of the African Union and other processes that look to facilitate mobility and migration. Another thing that is happening is that, you know, COVID is showing that we had such a high dependence on Europe and China in terms of the goods and services that we procure, more likely, more on the good side. And here we're talking about sometimes raw materials and sometimes finished goods, and often the finished goods. So we're not relying on each other a lot as trade partners. As an example, I once heard of in the very beginning when COVID had just hit, of how there was going to be a shortage of pasta in some countries in the western part of Africa, because this pasta comes from Italy. And due to the lockdowns and the border closures, there was not, you know, there was a lockdown also of goods to move across. But you can imagine that I have been to the Gambia and to Senegal. They make fantastic bread. They have the potential to make their own pasta, or they could look to a neighbor who is able to have that kind of capacity, or maybe have that advantage in terms of producing pasta. So a lot of these interconnections that would show, or simply that certain goods and raw materials would leave the African continent, go over to other countries, be reproduced, and come back as finished goods. When we could look to Rwanda, we could look to Uganda, we could look to other countries in Egypt, in West Africa as well, in trying to procure some of these services. To get shea butter, which is a very common product that is sitting in West Africa, it's probably easier sometimes to source it from the United Kingdom than it would be to transport it from Ghana in West Africa to Zambia in Southern Africa. So these kind of trade barriers were important, but they also show you the kind of barriers that we would have and the challenge that we would have when people now actually have to move. So when we talk about sort of COVID highlighting this high dependency that we have, it also shows that it highlighted the high dependency that we want to have on migration into Europe, migration to other parts of the world, before we look at the opportunities that are available on the continent, whether it's in education, work opportunities. And here we're talking about creating the space for legal pathways for people to be able to contribute to economies across borders. I also thought that there are a lot of things that come out. We also need to realize that the regional blocks are an opportunity for people to enhance, move it, for the numbers to go up. Technology has been an accelerator within the continent, and it's been something that, especially during COVID, has brought to the surface of the reason of the use, for instance, of social media, and how we can understand you know, the different opportunities that are available in different countries. But I think also bringing out the challenges that came out during the time of COVID, particularly in the lockdowns, and how migrants were doing in different countries where they have moved to. But definitely that we can use technological transfer as a means to encourage migration. You will see that in countries like Rwanda, they have gone ahead and have really tried to move higher education in a way to promote a lot of young Africans who are looking to further destinations to come to Rwanda and benefit from the higher education service that they offer. And this is in other areas, not just technology, but in many other areas. And of course, technology has come not, I would say, as a disruptor, but I think as one that highlights. Of course, there's a big report, I think, that has also come out maybe in the last couple of days, or is it a couple of weeks, that talks about the use of social media for irregular migration. and what that has also meant. But we can also harness some of these by working with the different partners on the ground. I think there is something to be said about a young mobile population on the African continent. As a matter of fact, this youngness of the African population has been one of the reasons that has been attributed to COVID not really taking a bigger footprint than it was expected to. You have a younger population in Africa. You also have a less mobile at the same time population in terms of global travel. And that also meant that we could get wind of the news of COVID, and some countries, as I said, were able to go into this lockdown mode. So then I thought we could move on to international migration. And does it come on? Yeah. And on international migration, I think I will not bore you with the figures of what they look like, but I think it's very important to talk about what influences international migration. And I think there's a lot of colonial history, the trade routes, of course, the proximity, for instance, to Europe has been very important. The Gulf as well is predominantly more and more the opportunities that are there. Zeroing on Europe, it's not really a surprise that we have a lot of migrants that predominantly head for the United Kingdom, for France, for Germany, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy. These are just some of the destinations. But even in places like the Balkan countries, you're beginning to see the numbers increase because people are out to look for opportunity in education, for work, for improved livelihoods. Then there's our old partners, India. We've been trading with India as a continent for a very long time at different levels for different countries. And the migration there has also changed over time. A lot of migration from the Indian continent, from India to the African continent in different countries as well. So when I was growing up, we used to say, when we used to consider the early settlers in those days, Indian community was seen to be prominent and very important to influence, and you can already see it in cultural influences in food as well, particularly when you go, for instance, to the coast of Africa, East Coast in this case. We're talking about migration towards countries like China. The United States remains important, but there are also other, global South destinations. South Korea, Japan, Malaysia are becoming more and more interesting destinations when we're looking at the trails and the motivations for international migration. And people are traveling for trade, for tourism, medical tourism, a big thing for India, for Thailand. And these are just some of the mobility and migration motivations, if I can list a few. And I think some others have been touched on in some of the presentations that were done a little bit earlier. China is Africa's biggest trade partner, like I mentioned before. So migration in that direction is on the increase. China has a very ambitious program to have more and more international students. And that means also tapping not only from its other partners, but also traditionally also on African countries where they have also had a presence also since pre-colonial times. So quite some traffic heading there. I thought to talk about some highlights of the trends in terms of international migration. There's a growing number of women and children on the move. And COVID, I think, has, even pre-COVID, we were able to see these numbers increasing, particularly from West Africa, whether they're using the Central Mediterranean route or the Western Mediterranean route. And I think this motivation, personal motivations can come from, young men having made the travels and the journeys. And now you see them bringing their families along, whether it's their nuclear families or their siblings or close family members in trying to journey together. And unfortunately, a lot of this has been in an irregular manner. I think we are all not very new to some of the news we have heard a few weeks ago, for instance, of a woman who delivered a baby on a boat just off the coast of Libya. And these are the kind of stories that depict this type of irregular migration, when migrants don't have a legal pathway, but they understand that there's an opportunity at the end of it. What's really happening around that space remains in the control of all actors. So it's the sending countries, the transit countries, and the receiving countries. So it's a global responsibility on how we manage this growing trend so that it becomes safe, regular, responsible, and most definitely a dignified way to make the journey to improve people's livelihoods. I'm also reminded, thinking about, a concept that I heard about in the Gambia, which was called Go Spain, Go Morocco. And it was basically to say, once you reach Morocco, you have seen the shores of Spain. You are definitely there from the northern parts. And these kind of messages, if we could call them messages, that went out in, we can call it maybe the in terms of irregular brokerage, in encouraging migrants to say, as soon as you get to Morocco, you've got the prospects of getting to Spain, show that there is something on the other side. And it's about governments sitting together and realizing how we can make more routes, pathways, so people can travel in a much more dignified way and don't have to use the so-called backways into Europe. Some very interesting reports that came out from UNDP, for instance, that, spoke to different migrants and tried to understand what was really happening to them during their journeys and what really motivated them to take these journeys into Europe. A lot of things that would set off, or something that somebody would think about is to say, well, if I don't have a higher education, what's the prospect of going? But you found out from reports such as the one from the UNDP and also other reports that migrants' ages still there. That the level of education did not really determine, or was not a deterring factor for people to migrate. And as a matter of fact, a lot of young men and women left when they were around 16, at least from those who were being interviewed in this UNDP report. So that showed that they had some level of literacy, maybe some level, but not highly skilled. And therefore, but still, they could find opportunities on the other side. Whether this is decent work is another question that would need to be addressed. Just moving along very quickly, because I don't think we try to chase on time. I could try and finish early. Let's talk about the other routes that remain as part of the trails and the motivations. And here we can look at, for instance, the GCC countries. And here we have seen more and more women taking the journey to work in the domestic work industry, facilitated by recruiters, often that they do not know, often that don't have credible or have no representation in their home countries, often that have not been vetted by home country, let's say, authorities, or are even vaguely aware of who they are. But suffice to say that young women and men who are trying to join the construction industry in the GCC countries take these journeys. So also in a very unsafe and looks dignified, because they jump on planes for some of them, young girls coming from Sudan, from Kenya, from Uganda, from Ethiopia, taking the journey to these GCC countries and other countries where they go to work as domestic workers. But the safe part and ignoring their vulnerabilities as young girls in this case. I think that it's not a new thing to a lot of people who are in this room that, you know, there's a lot of abuses around domestic workers. So these are some of the things that would need to be taken into consideration when we're looking at the agreements, if at all we have any on the ground, with some of the countries that are receiving our domestic workers. How can we really make sure that, I like what Shabri from ILO this morning said, that protection starts from home, that we don't hand over the responsibility to protect migrants, regardless of their status, to the receiving country or to the employer. Because we do know that employers, recruitment agencies, and all that represent will try to cut corners. And migrants' rights may be something that adds a cost, and they're trying to reduce costs. So I think it's very important that we bring this back as the responsibility of the sending country. And that goes also for the embassies that represent the home country. What kind of role do they play in ensuring that these rights of migrants are granted to them while they're in transit and when they have arrived? I was reading a story, I think it's a feature that has come out in Al Jazeera. And there I will just see if I can pick it. There you go, you have it. Can you see that? Good. And here it was talking about I think it's the 400,000 plus migrant workers that are in Lebanon. And the key countries mentioned there: Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Cameroon, of course, Bangladesh, Philippines, India. As some of, I mean, it's 400,000 migrant workers that are there and who have been impacted in one way or another. Some have been able to maintain their jobs, some haven't, and are in the unfortunate situations of either being dumped in front of their embassies or going to make protests in front of the embassies. I think some of the pictures you will see there are actually coming from that article from Al Jazeera. And some are just trying to see how they can make the return home now that borders are open. But flights are much more expensive, and some are in an irregular situation. So a lot of support still needs to go for these stranded migrants. And this is what has happened to them during this COVID period, that they feel left alone, that they feel very vulnerable, and that they're in a situation in some cases where they don't know when to return because they are breadwinners in their home countries. And so some would stay and be subjected to abuse because it's better, as in some cases have said, that they face this level of abuse than they let their families die. Other nightmares, as I call them, and this one I call it a transit nightmare, is, you know, looking at the case, for instance, in Niger, where smugglers and traffickers, and in some reports, it's also talked about officials being involved in the abuse of migrants on their way, whether they were taking bribes from them or traffickers trying to show that they can facilitate their way in this irregular way. Then other nightmares, which seem not so much of a nightmare, but in some cases they are, because they really form more of a forced labor scenario than work, because it's definitely not decent work, is where a lot of migrants, a number of migrants, have been seen to transit on their way to Libya and to other transit centers into Europe to stop by Mali and do work in the mining sector. And here we're talking about women and children being subjected to work, which is not decent work, and in some cases is facilitated by traffickers. The maltreatment of migrants in Libya is something that's not very new. I actually feel often uncomfortable that we have gotten used to these pictures of these boats, seeing vessels pushing further and further away, these small, fragile boats packed with migrants that are trying to make the journey. I think the world has become a little bit too comfortable with these images. And from the stories, the very dramatic stories that are coming from people who are missing at sea. So those are part of the transit nightmares. Going east, the increased cooperation with China, like I said, our continued relations with countries such as India, new relations with Malaysia, or I would say newer, Japan, South Korea, I think are just some of the indications of what the trails and motivations will be for migration. And a lot of these have been for medical tourism, have been for prospects for higher education, and in some cases also settlement, because they are greener pastures. As an example, the Ethiopian Prime Minister has, and also other government officials from other countries, are really trying to establish this very strong relation, for instance, with China, and realizing that, you know, if you have deeper economic links and cultural links, it's very important for you to move to the next ambitions that you have in terms of an industrialization program. But that will also fall back on the fact that you will need this young population that's sitting in Ethiopia, in other parts of the continent, to be educated to a certain level. And since the trend is for education to be sought from elsewhere, the drive to get educated in other parts of the world, particularly China, where this economic ties seem to be getting stronger and stronger, will be visible. And therefore migration would also be more likely to increase, especially if China increases, for instance, incentives such as scholarships or internship programs after somebody graduates, to gain that technical experience that they can bring home. So that kind of migration would seem to be very interesting. Another thing that makes migrating east for education to places like India and China and South Korea and Japan is that the cost of education in other parts like Australia, the United States, the UK, are increasingly becoming more and more. And these other countries seem to have a much more favorable package, especially for migrants that are moving with private scholarship, so funded by their own families. Let's talk a little bit again. I mixed a bit with the lockdown, but I thought I could just add two more issues there. Coming home during the lockdown, what has this meant actually for international migrants? I think the lockdowns and the border closures, they didn't help much. Like I said, in Lebanon, this is just one of the countries that showed you stranded migrants in dire stress. And this is just one of those countries. Yemen would be another place. Stories from China, which were also combined with discrimination against people of, let's say, Black ethnicity, also increased in one way the returns, because this had not been managed very well in the beginning. But it's good to note that we're at a different stage now where I think sending governments, so the African governments, not just in China in terms of the embassies, but also on the continent, the African Union, as well as the Chinese government, not just at the central level, but also at the local levels, were able to realize that there can be a problem with discrimination if it's not dealt with in a much more official way. And these hands coming together, even though there's still a lot of work to be done around this issue, was very important during COVID to show that discrimination against Black people would not be tolerated in China. And therefore, migrants who have moved to China can feel safe. And migrants, African migrants who have moved to China, can also feel that there are some efforts that would be made to make them feel much more integrated into this new place that they are calling home, whether it's for a long term or for a temporary period. But still, issues that are related to irregular migration and how that is being managed still need a lot of tweaking and also a lot of talking, but also a lot of action. I think it's also interesting to see, just, flipping the coin to the positive side of things, that when the pandemic broke out in China, African governments were also quick to gather together in a way, even though a little bit late, to try and see how many returns, because the situation, particularly for the students who were out in Wuhan, which was quite a huge number. We're talking 4,000, or even not, if not more, who were stranded and didn't really know. Some governments, for instance, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, these were among some of those that returned some of their migrants from China at this time. So this kind of consular support was very important to see. I think there was also a lot of support that came from the diaspora, and this was also very important, also in other parts of the world, to show the kind of support that went in terms of supporting migrants who were stranded, not just in China, but in other places as well. I'm reminded of a very vibrant diaspora group, or the group of migrants who are in Malaysia, that provided support to young men who were stranded in the Malaysia airport. Two South Africans, I think it was, who were stranded in an airport in Malaysia with basically nowhere to go. And they could finance some nights into a hotel and some food because they could not provide any shelter given the lockdowns. So this was also another angle that you saw coming out a lot during COVID, that support that came from diaspora groups. And that example is not just limited to these two, it can also be extended to other places. Diaspora engagement onto the continent, of the kind of support that has gone, and also localized support that has gone from diaspora groups in the communities where they are. In terms of, then I thought I should just move and talk a bit about the prospects that we have. And then I think I'll be wrapping up in a bit so that we can have a Q&A session. I think we have an opportunity to reset. And this opportunity to reset exists in an environment where we have enough international frameworks, enough international policies. In some cases, we've exhausted the number of structures that we can even create at the national level to try and deal with some of the challenges that we have seen of governing migration. And at the local level, much more can be done in bringing them a bit closer, because migrants are living in their vicinity. So maybe just going a little bit up, I thought I could run through them a little bit quickly. Obviously, sitting on top of our chart is the Agenda 2030, and particularly looking at SDG 10, which I think is resounding for all of us in migration space, orderly, safe, regular, responsible migration and mobility. I'm sometimes surprised that we don't have an acronym for these words, but maybe it's important that we don't, because it helps us see these words and see them actually as fundamental principles that will define the type of migration that we want to see in the future, that it's orderly, that it's safe, that it's regular, and that it's responsible. And I think a lot of concrete measures have gone, meaning, the next steps have happened after this. And, I think the COVID impact is just a way to help us, sort of give us a bit of a nudge to fast track what we haven't done and what needs to keep going. The Global Compact for Migration, I could not leave a meeting like this without talking about what an opportunity it presents to us, not just as a compact. I mean, some would say, for instance, in Europe, they would say, oh, only 19 European countries have adopted this. Oh, only so many African countries have adopted it, with the exception of a few. I think there's much more to be said about how we take it to the next phase, rather than for us getting more signatures. For those of us who've signed up, I think it's very important that these national prioritization plans go into real action plans that really encompass a whole of government, a whole of society. I mean, a whole of government approach that is taking place in a whole of society environment, because it's not one-sided. It's not about a sending country or a receiving country. It's everything else from the beginning to the end and what's happening in the middle in terms of the migrants' journey. So the Global Compact for Migration obviously has to be much more, I mean, the implementation of it has to be much more intentional. And here we're talking about, you know, is it talking about collecting accurate, adequate and disaggregated data and how we use it for decision making? What are we doing around curbing human trafficking and smuggling? How are we really working at managing our borders, taking care that migrants need to move, but we also have security in you know, as part of the agenda, as an immigration service, as a security service, as a Ministry of Home Affairs. How do we want to address the vulnerabilities of these migrants? Can we unpack them, because they do have vulnerabilities? Where do we put gender? Have we really understood how climate change, environment is impacting on this? Have we really understood what's happening to opportunities for the youth? Have we really looked into that? How about returns? And, you know, the opportunity of COVID, before, returns were also very restricted to a number of countries that have been in this mode of, you know, perpetual returns, if you want. But, you know, COVID gave the possibility of having a return from any possible country on the planet. And therefore, we've been able to test our policies, our frameworks, our action plans. Are we really doing enough on return policy? Are we doing sufficient on reintegration of these migrants back into our societies so that they can improve livelihoods from home? And then there are things like, you know, strengthening cooperation. How are we really intentional on that? What are the things we bring to the table? How prepared are we to give and to take? What is the role of local governments and civil society and the media in all this? Faith-based organizations, community leaders, migrant groups themselves, a whole of society approach. So not just leaving migration to those who are vested with the migration responsibility in our communities, but understanding that anybody can have this responsibility and has this responsibility as long as we're encountering migrants. How do we look at social protection issues? I mean, it can be unpacked, and this is the part of the webinars that actually GRFDT is co-organizing with other civil society networks on just unpacking this Global Compact for Migration, but really understanding how can we break it down, not just for students, practitioners, experts, scholars, in really taking it to the next phase. What are we doing about fair recruitment? What about wage theft? These kind of issues. So I think that Global Compact for Migration gives us another opportunity in terms of looking at prospects and developments from the international setting. Another thing to be said, the use of technology in migration. I think I've already implored on this, on how, you know, migrants and diaspora groups are really an important channel for us to understand how can you transfer technology from destination countries back to origins. So migrants don't just bring with them the remittances. So governments shouldn't just be interested in their remittances, but should also be interested in the you know, the non-financial resources that they would have. And technological transfer is definitely one of the critical ones that could help with this reset, that could help move this population of young unemployed to start looking at things like startups, to start looking at e-commerce, to start looking at the use of blockchain technology. because it sounds so complicated, even for scholars like you and me here. But how do we unpack these things to governments, to civil society, and to others? You know, how do we work also with data scientists in helping us understand? How do we work with private sector in leveraging those benefits that could bring transformation or change from engaging the diaspora? I think it's also important to think about the prospects of that there are families on the move. How can we heighten our protection measures and elevate them, because there are women, there are children in that crowd. There are women and children in the boats. There are women and children accompanying migrants from wherever they're coming from, whether they're in an irregular or an irregular way. Maybe the last thing, and I quickly, because I already touched, I think, on, for instance, gender. I just wanted to say something, for instance, about international cooperation and where this stands from the international migration space vis-a-vis Africa, Europe. Well, we've had, you know, renewed relations with the European Union. Some call it EU Partnership 3.0, some say it's 2.0, where we're really resetting as a continent to think, how are we going to leverage this relationship that we have and this partnership so that it brings back actual benefits to citizens on the ground. So we are no longer the African continent that was mainly illiterate, mainly not understanding where it wanted to go, but we're much more educated, we're much more technologically savvy, even if we don't have all the tools in our hands. We're much more eager as well. There's a younger population, so we're willing to work. And there's also a hunger to move livelihoods forward, because there's high levels of poverty still. So I think it's still very important. It's still very important to understand what that relationship means, and particularly going down to migration. The European Commission, I think it's just in September that they've different aspects that are needed for this European approach to migration, so that we have improved and faster procedures, whether it's asylum or migration assistance. And it's also making sure that there's a bit of a fair share, if you like, from the European side and solidarity around the issue of migration. Rebuilding trust, obviously, among the member states, it's important for us to see, because this is where our migrants are landing. And then also we need to feel a little bit more confident that, that the European Union has the capacity to manage migration pathways, managing irregular migration in standards that are considered golden standard or best practices. And I think we've been able to see some of the adjustments of some of the players. Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands are just some of the countries that were able to loosen some of their rules and regulations that pertain to irregular migration or managing migration during this time of COVID. So if that can be done, if hundreds of thousands of migrants in Italy can be granted legal status because they are considered essential workers. They were essential workers even before COVID came on, so they can continue to be that. And so how do we move all these things that we've been able to see are possible during the time of COVID? How do we move with that same spirit post-COVID? And different kind of arrangements. I think the Bologna process is another one, which is quite interesting, very strategic, because we're talking about student mobility within Europe, trying to make Europe much more attractive for student mobility. That's sort of important, and that will be interesting to see how European countries try to facilitate sort of this. I mean, it's temporal mobility. It's temporal because it's it's mobility, but still, what that sort of means. And how much more, for instance, African countries can leverage from the so-called, let's say, the EU researchers' mobility visas that are available and other pathways that are available. So how do we open up those spaces? Continued friendship with our friends in the Global South, India, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and even others in Latin America. And I think also understanding these new waves of migration trickling into Latin America, I think this is still a bit of a blurry area, which still remains very much in, it remains, very much undigested, largely on media reports, not so much of action from the countries that are concerned into this irregular flow of migration that has started in the last decade or more, and in understanding how we can curb that, but also what it means and what's really going on with these migrants. So I think those kind of things need to be taken care of. Our big buyer, China, how do we cooperate with them? We are at a very important stage in our relationship. It's 20 years of cooperation. There's a forum on cooperation between China and African countries and this so-called FOCAG. And we're reviewing this relationship. Really, what is Africa bringing to the table? And that's also very important, that we just don't wait to receive, but we are actually ready with what we want to gain from these relationships. The same goes with the Belt and Road Initiative and all other initiatives that are out there. How do we leverage them in terms of knowledge transfer and culture to culture transfers? But of course, this is in the midst of all the staggering debt that we have to China. We cannot forget that. It's in the back of our pocket as we negotiate. But I think we can keep some of these things in our pockets as we negotiate other areas that help the African continent move to the next level. And then I think I just wanted to borrow 2 or 3 points, if I have the time, to maybe sound out some of the points that have been raised in a recent migration report on West and Central Africa, that I think basically aims to say, if we don't address the inequalities, the vulnerabilities, and understand the specific issues along each of these corridors, whether it's on the continent or outside the continent, we'll miss the goal, regardless of which framework we pick to pick the problem. So I think there is something that needs to be done about understanding who we are working with in terms of the migrant groups, in terms of the migrants themselves, in terms of listening to the migrants, as we come to put our action plans together on how we address vulnerabilities. I think there is also something to be said about when we look at these migrant profiles and their circumstances, we really try to break down what are the linkages between that, because it's the only way for us to understand the risks that they face and what's happening around them coping with these risks. And this takes me to another point, which talks about, what are those flexible mobility-based strategies that contribute to migrants and their communities' resilience and development. And here I'm reminded of a report by the Mixed Migration Center and the UNHCR report. I think it came out somewhere in July, where it's really calling for measures, because this report was really looking at, what measures can be made out there that can hold perpetrators, of crimes and human rights violations along these routes, that they need to be much more accountable, that you need to have measures that assist and protect the migrants, and that you need to have greater cooperation between the states. This morning, I think we heard from ILO keynote speaker, and he was talking about how countries like Qatar and other states in the GCC have gone ahead to sort of come up with these measures that try to protect migrants, whether it's minimum wage or are trying to work around the kafala system, for instance. And that how these measures, while they continue to happen, it doesn't stop us on the other side to talk about what we need to do in terms of protection measures. And I think that's a resounding point that comes out even in many of the presentations that have been made. And of course, enhancing that access to justice. So I think with these words, I can say that, my very last slide is that I've been a bit excited to follow through social media, like I think all of us do, some prominent names. And there's a young lady called Halima Aden, who is a model, and she comes from Somalia and was resettled in the United States. I think she's one of the first models who came out with a hijab on a runway. So we're talking fashion here. And this is just to say that we cannot do without migrants. And migration can be better. It can be balanced. It has to be balanced. It can obviously not always be good news, not always the bad news, but there is a balance. And there is something, maybe two things to say here. One is that migrants do contribute positively to our communities, not just in the destination countries, but in the home countries. As you can see at the post there that I picked from a UNICEF website that talks about the UNICEF ambassador, the Goodwill ambassador, Halima Aden, who continues to do work, her herself being a refugee. And then the next post there is about foreign-born players in Switzerland, and it's basically highlighting, you know, migrants from Cameroon, from Senegal, Tunisia, Morocco, who formed part of the Swiss national team in the 2018 World Cup, and how important migrants are really connected to our everyday world, whether it's food, fashion, football, or many other areas of our lives back home, as well as in the destination countries. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paddy, for a very broad spanned presentation. In fact, going into scenarios from Africa and elsewhere, into intra-African migrations from the continent, instances of welfare order that has been mobilized, generally in times of crisis, specificities of the younger populations and implications, and motivating, pushing factors. I mean, so many other things as well. Implementation at the global level, for instance, the context of migrants who come from seriously and sensitively factored in places, and lots of other contentious issues like the transit. So I'm not even trying to sum that up, but thanks a lot for that broad span presentation, which really demonstrates your experience with the scenario. And let me ask Ashika to please handle the possible queries that have come up. And with your permission, Paddy, I'm inviting Ashika. Thank you, Ashika.
Good evening, everyone. That was a very insightful session, ma'am. So you have a question from Dr. Sadananda Sahu. So I'll be reading the question for you. The question is, most African countries have very less COVID-19 cases. However, there are other issues such as return migration, especially female migration. So what are the different types of measures taken by the local government with regards to this issue?
Okay, thank you for that question. Let me see, is the...
Ma'am, you may answer.
Thank you. I think the role of local government is something that could have been done better. And here we're talking pre-COVID, during COVID, and maybe even more saying the future can involve much more involvement of the local government. Like I said, they become the epicenter. They become this is where the migrants would live. And I think in some local governments, you have had community initiatives, not led, if you like, by central governments, but by local governments, initiatives that are coming from local governments to try and integrate migrants in the so-called social protection schemes. But in a lot of countries, migrants are not seen as part of the vulnerable. And this has a lot to do with registration. And, you know, for those who are working in social protection areas, you would know that, I mean, how do you make transfers, whether they're cash or non-transfer or non-cash transfers to vulnerable groups? And this is essentially the issue. that migrants are not sitting as part of these social registries where they exist, or are not just counted for as part of the vulnerable groups. In fact, I think in some countries, there is a case that was seen in South Africa where, of course, community support was always important because it's either came in the form of a faith-based organization or some kind of a network that's linked to the diaspora or local community initiatives that bring community members together that would involve migrants, but very specific targeted initiatives were also evident. So for instance, those who would be working with migrants that work on, let's say, on farms and so on, you know, what kind of support is going for them. But to have it, I think, like, you know, like the India example, I like the examples that we are talking about, for instance, in Kerala, about, you know, sort of having this very proactive local government that really tries to use its resources to support migrants that are returning, but also support some of the migrants that they have. I think this was quite missing. And more could definitely be done because it is possible, regardless of the fact that you don't have a set framework. And also, in some cases, migrants are irregular, and therefore they are not really featuring on any kind of register. They would get support, for instance, maybe if they go to a public hospital to get tested. But in terms of the support that they would need during hospitalization, this would need to be run by communities. Yeah.
Thank you for answering the question, ma'am. Over to you, Matthew, sir.
Thank you once again, and I assume that there are no more queries. And Paddy, once again, happy that you were there with us.